Humble girl is mocked at graduation, but when she takes the stage, everyone is stunned. Maria Turner tightened the strap of her worn-out backpack, the fabric fraying where years of use had taken their toll. She turned back to see her mother, Anna, standing at the doorway of their modest house, arms crossed, eyes brimming with quiet encouragement. Anna didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her presence alone reminded Maria of the stakes. Every step she took towards school was a step towards something better, something bigger. Maria hesitated for just a moment before giving her mother a small nod, as if to say, "I'll be okay." Anna nodded back, her lips pressing together in a thin, hopeful smile. With that, Maria walked toward the bus stop, her mind already preparing for another day in a place that tested her resolve more than it nurtured her dreams. The school corridors buzzed with the usual chaos of students exchanging gossip, shoving past each other, and forming tight-knit cliques that claimed their corners of the space. Maria moved purposefully through the crowd, her head high, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. She knew that somewhere in the sea of faces, Grace Donovan and her entourage were lying in wait. Speak of the devil, Maria thought bitterly as she spotted Grace near the lockers. Grace's hair was perfectly styled, her clothes immaculate, exuding a level of effortlessness that only came with privilege. Jason Myers, the star quarterback, stood next to her, chuckling at something Peter Collins had said. Emily Ford leaned against the lockers, examining her nails but clearly attuned to the conversation. Grace's gaze zeroed in on Maria like a predator sizing up its prey. "Oh look, it's Maria," Grace called out, her voice loud enough to ensure half the hallway turned to watch. "Maria and that ancient thing she calls a bag. Honestly, I think it's a family heirloom." Jason snickered, but his laugh faltered when he noticed Maria's expression didn't waver. Peter, ever the opportunist, jumped in with his usual sarcasm. "Come on, Grace. Maybe it's vintage. You know, like those retro stores downtown? Except, less chic." Emily added with a mock gasp, "Do you think she got it in one of those thrift shops where they sell things by the pound?" The group erupted in laughter, their voices echoing down the corridor. Maria's face burned, but she refused to show them any satisfaction. Instead, she tightened her grip on the strap of her bag and walked past them without a word, her footsteps steady, her gaze forward. "Hey, Maria." Jason called after her, a hint of something, guilt? Amusement? In his voice. She ignored him. Inside her classroom, Maria exhaled, grateful for the relative sanctuary. As she reached her seat, the door opened, and Mr. Robert Winston entered, carrying a stack of papers. The room quieted. Winston had a commanding presence, not through intimidation, but through the kind of respect he naturally inspired. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice warm but firm. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Maria. "Miss Turner, a moment?" Maria stood, her heart racing. Had she done something wrong? As she approached, Mr. Winston handed her a paper marked with a bright red A and a note scribbled in the margin. "Brilliant insights. Let's discuss after class." "Your analysis of Great Expectations was exceptional," he said quietly, just for her to hear. "I'd like to go over some of your points later. It's not often I see work like this." Maria blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Winston. I'd like that." "Good," he said with a small smile before turning back to the class. "Now let's begin." The day passed in a blur, but Mr. Winston's words lingered in Maria's mind. When the final bell rang, she found herself standing outside his office, the paper clutched in her hand. He opened the door before she could knock, as if expecting her. "Maria," he greeted, gesturing for her to sit. His office was cramped, filled with shelves of books and papers stacked haphazardly. It smelled faintly of old leather and coffee. "I'm glad you came." Maria sat, feeling out of place yet oddly at ease. Mr. Winston didn't waste time. "Maria," he began, his tone serious but kind, "do you know what makes you stand out?" She hesitated, unsure if this was a rhetorical question. No sir." "Your perspective," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Your ability to see beyond the obvious, to connect dots most people miss. That's rare." Maria shifted in her seat. "I'm not sure what to say. I mean, I try, but people like Grace don't exactly see it that way." "Grace Donovan doesn't define you," he said firmly. "What matters is where you're going. Have you thought about applying to schools like Princeton or Harvard?" Maria's eyes widened. "Harvard? Princeton? Me? I mean, no, not really. Someone like me doesn't." "Stop," Mr. Winston interrupted. That's nonsense. Someone like you is exactly who those places need. You've got talent, Maria. Raw talent. And you've got the resilience to back it up. That combination? It's unstoppable. Maria swallowed hard, her emotions a tangle of disbelief and cautious hope. But how would I even? I mean, the costs alone. There are ways, he assured her. Scholarships, grants. I'll help you. But first, you have to believe it's possible. For a moment, Maria couldn't speak. Finally, she managed, "Thank you, Mr. Winston." "Really?" He smiled, leaning back in his chair. "We'll start with a plan. Bring me a list of schools you're interested in tomorrow. The sky's the limit, Maria." As she left his office, Maria felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. But she knew better than to let it fully take hold. For every step forward, there would be obstacles waiting to pull her back. And Grace Donovan was always one of them. The halls were nearly empty as Maria made her way toward the exit. But even in the quiet, she could hear the distant laughter of Grace and her friends. She didn't look back. Grace Donovan sat in the middle of the cafeteria, her posture straight, her arms crossed tightly over her designer sweater. The table around her buzzed with the chatter of Emily, Peter, and Jason, but Grace's focus was elsewhere. The news that Mr. Winston had singled out Maria Turner for her exceptional work had traveled fast. Grace hated it. "She thinks she can compete with me?" Grace said, her voice low but laced with venom. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she glanced toward Maria, who sat alone across the cafeteria. Emily tilted her head, twirling a strand of her perfectly curled hair. "What's the big deal, Grace? She's just Maria. You know she can't actually beat you at anything that matters." "It's not just about her," Grace snapped, her composure cracking for a moment. "It's about the principal. If she keeps getting attention like this, people might start thinking she belongs here." Jason, who had been half listening while picking at his fries, raised an eyebrow. "You're taking this way too personally, Grace. Winston likes her paper." "Big deal. Big deal." Grace echoed sharply. She straightened her posture and fixed her gaze on Jason. "It is a big deal. She's trying to step out of her place, and someone has to remind her where she belongs." Peter leaned back in his chair, his usual smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. "So what's the plan?" "You always have a plan." Grace's lips curled into a cold, calculating smile. "Oh, I've got one. Trust me." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "We're going to make sure she understands exactly what happens when someone like her tries to act like she's on our level." On the other side of the cafeteria, Maria sat alone at a corner table, her tray barely touched. She had debated skipping lunch altogether. Her younger brother, Luke, had even suggested it that morning. "Why don't you just come home for lunch?" he'd asked. "It's better than dealing with them." But Maria refused to let Grace or anyone else dictate her day. Still, as she picked half-heartedly at her food, she could feel their eyes on her. Their whispers and laughter, though distant, carried a weight that pressed down on her shoulders. She clenched her fork tightly, telling herself it didn't matter. They didn't matter. She had bigger things to focus on: her studies, her dreams, her future. But that resolve wavered when Grace's laugh, sharp and unmistakable, cut through the room. Maria didn't look up, but she felt the sting of it all the same. Later that day, as Maria walked toward her locker, she noticed a small crowd of students lingering nearby, whispering and glancing her way. Her heart sank. The closer she got, the clearer it became why they were there. Her locker was covered in papers, dozens of them. Some were taped to the door, others stuffed into the vents, their corners jutting out like taunts. Each one was scrawled with insults: loser, trash, scholarship scum. The cruel words burned into her vision, and her breath hitched. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen. Then, taking a deep breath, she reached for the papers. Her hands trembled as she began to pull them off one by one, crumpling them into a ball. She fought the sting of tears, determined not to let anyone see her break. "Turner," a sharp voice called from behind. Maria turned to see Principal Helen Bates standing a few feet away, her expression stern. "My office. Now." Maria followed Principal Bates down the hallway, her mind racing. Had she done something wrong? Were the papers somehow her fault? When they entered the office, Maria was startled to see Mr. Winston already there, leaning casually against the edge of Bates's desk. His usual warmth was tempered by something harder, disappointment, perhaps, or frustration. "Take a seat, Maria," Bates said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Maria sat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Maria," Bates began, her tone measured, "we're aware of what's been happening. The harassment, the bullying, it hasn't gone unnoticed." Maria blinked, surprised. She had always assumed the faculty turned a blind eye to the dynamics at play in the school. I didn't think anyone noticed." Mr. Winston interrupted gently. "We notice. And we're not going to ignore it." Maria's stomach churned. "Thank you, but I can handle it. I don't want to cause trouble." "This isn't just about you," Bates said firmly. "When someone like Grace Donovan thinks they can get away with this, it sets a precedent. If we don't act, it tells every student here that bullying is acceptable." Maria looked down, her emotions a swirling mix of gratitude and discomfort. She didn't want to be the center of attention, even for something like this. "Maria," Winston said, his voice softer now, "you're an example to more people than you realize. You're showing them what it means to rise above. But that doesn't mean you have to do it alone." Maria hesitated. "What are you going to do?" "That depends," Bates said, her expression unreadable. "We want to know if you're willing to let us take action. It could mean more attention on you in the short term, but it might make a difference in the long run." Maria's chest tightened. She thought of Grace, of her sneering smile and sharp words. She thought of Luke, of how much he looked up to her. She thought of the students who sat silent, watching, wishing they could stand up but not knowing how. Finally, she nodded. "Do what you think is right." Bates exchanged a glance with Winston, who gave a small nod. "We'll handle it," Bates said. As Maria left the office, her thoughts were a chaotic blur. She wasn't sure if she felt relieved or even more burdened. She walked past the rows of lockers, her eyes fixed on the floor. The whispers and stares followed her like shadows, but she didn't look up. Whatever came next, Maria knew one thing for certain: Grace Donovan wasn't done with her yet. Jason Myers sat at the edge of the cafeteria table, his tray untouched as his gaze drifted toward Grace Donovan. She was in the middle of an animated discussion, her hands gesturing sharply as she outlined what he could only assume was her next elaborate scheme. Jason couldn't focus on the words. He wasn't sure when the unease had started creeping in, but it was louder now, harder to ignore. "Jason, are you even listening?" Grace's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. He blinked, turning back to her. "Yeah, I heard you. Something about the announcements tomorrow." Grace narrowed her eyes, her annoyance clear. "Not something. I said we're going to make sure Maria's little moment of glory doesn't last. By the time I'm done, she'll wish she never stepped foot in this school." Emily Ford laughed, her voice light and unbothered. Classic Grace. Always keeping things in order. Jason forced a chuckle, but it felt hollow. He watched as Peter chimed in with some sarcastic remark, earning more laughter from the group. None of it sat right with him. By the time the lunch period ended, Jason's thoughts were still tangled. He replayed Grace's words in his head, the smug certainty in her tone. Her plans had always been cruel, but lately they felt different, darker, more personal. Later that afternoon, he spotted Maria in the library. She sat alone at one of the corner tables, her head bent over a notebook. Books surrounded her, some open, others stacked neatly. She looked focused, but there was a tension in her shoulders that Jason couldn't ignore. He hesitated by the entrance, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The right thing to do was obvious, but it felt like crossing an invisible line. Grace would be furious if she found out. Still, the guilt gnawed at him. Finally, he took a deep breath and walked over. "Maria," he said softly, his voice almost getting lost in the quiet hum of the library. She glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw who it was. "Jason." He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly unsure of himself. "Can I talk to you? Just for a minute." Maria's hand hovered over her notebook, her suspicion evident. "About what?" Jason glanced around, making sure no one else was close enough to hear. "About Grace. And everything that's been happening." Her expression hardened. "What about it?" Jason sat down across from her, without waiting for an invitation. "I think it's gone too far. The stuff she's planning. It's not right." Maria leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "And you just figured that out?" You've been laughing along with her for years. He winced at her words, the weight of her accusation settling heavily on him. I know. I've been part of it, and I'm not proud of that. But it's different now. She's targeting you in a way that feels personal. Maria finished for him, her tone sharp. Yeah, I noticed. Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I don't expect you to trust me, but I thought you should know. Grace isn't going to stop unless someone does something. Maria's eyes searched his face, trying to gauge his sincerity. Why are you telling me this? You're one of her closest friends. Jason hesitated, his fingers tapping against the table. Maybe I'm tired of being a follower, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Maybe I'm tired of pretending that what she does is okay. Maria studied him for a long moment, her skepticism evident. If that's true, then do something about it. Don't just come to me expecting me to fix it. Jason looked away, guilt flickering across his face. You're right. I need to figure this out. But I thought you deserved a heads up. Before Maria could respond, Jason stood abruptly. I should go. Maria watched as he walked away, his steps hurried as if he were running from his own conscience. She wanted to believe him, but experience had taught her to be cautious. Words were easy, actions were harder. Jason didn't return to the cafeteria after leaving the library. Instead, he wandered the empty halls, his mind racing. He thought about the way Grace spoke about Maria, the way Emily and Peter fed off her cruelty. It all felt so pointless. For the first time, he wondered why he had ever gone along with it. When he reached his locker, he leaned against it, exhaling deeply. He had no idea what to do next, but one thing was clear: he couldn't keep standing by while Grace tore someone else down. As the final bell rang, Jason felt a sense of urgency building. Tomorrow, Grace's plan would be set in motion, and if he didn't act now, he'd be complicit all over again. In the distance, Maria walked toward the exit, her head held high despite the weight she carried. Jason watched her go, a newfound respect stirring within him. Maybe there's still time to make this right, he thought. The next day loomed with unspoken tension, and Jason knew his decision would have consequences he couldn't yet predict. Maria stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple yet elegant dress her mother had saved for this night. The weight of what lay ahead pressed on her, heavier than she had anticipated. This wasn't just another school event. This was her chance to prove to herself, and everyone else, that she belonged. Behind her, Anna Turner's reflection appeared in the mirror. Her mother placed a hand on Maria's shoulder, her expression a mix of pride and determination. You have every right to be there, Anna said firmly. Don't let anyone take this moment from you. Show them what you're made of. Luke, Maria's younger brother, chimed in from the doorway, his grin lopsided but sincere. Yeah, Maria. Knock him dead. Maria couldn't help but smile at her brother's attempt to lighten the mood. She took a deep breath and nodded. Okay. I can do this. The school auditorium was buzzing when Maria arrived. Rows of chairs were filled with students and their families, while others milled about near the back, chatting in hushed tones. Maria could feel the weight of their stares as she entered, some curious, others judgmental. Grace Donovan's laugh carried through the room, sharp and deliberate, a reminder that her presence was far from welcome. Maria scanned the crowd, her eyes landing on Jason Myers. He was leaning against the wall near the refreshments table, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, disappearing into the crowd. Maria's stomach churned. She had a feeling Grace had something planned. Grace always had something planned. But whatever it was, Maria wasn't going to back down. Backstage, Grace stood with Emily, Peter, and Jason. Grace's eyes glittered with malicious glee as she reviewed the final details of her plan. Okay, Grace said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial tone. When Maria gets up to speak, Peter will cue the tech guy to cut the lights. We'll project the slides right after. It'll be perfect. Jason frowned. Slides. Grace smirked, holding up a flash drive. Oh, just a little collection of embarrassing photos. You know, a reminder of who Maria Turner really is. Let's see how confident she feels after that. Jason's stomach twisted. Grace, don't you think that's a bit much? Emily rolled her eyes. Come on, Jason. Don't start with the moral high ground now. I'm serious, Jason said, his voice firmer this time. This isn't some harmless prank. It's cruel. Grace shot him a sharp look. What's cruel is her thinking she's better than us. I'm just putting her in her place." Jason clenched his jaw. He had stayed quiet for too long, but tonight was different. He couldn't let this happen. "I'll be back," he muttered, slipping away before Grace could protest. Maria waited in the wings, clutching the note cards for her speech. Her hands trembled slightly, but she reminded herself of why she was here. This night wasn't about Grace or anyone else. It was about her journey, her resilience, and everything she had worked so hard for. As her name was called, Maria stepped onto the stage, the spotlight illuminating her. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes locked on her. She swallowed hard, her voice shaky as she began. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her words barely audible at first. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Gasps rippled through the audience. Maria froze, her heart pounding as whispers broke out. She glanced toward the back of the auditorium, where Grace was sitting, a smug smile playing on her lips. But then, nothing happened. The lights stabilized, and Maria's microphone remained on. Grace's smirk faltered, her eyes darting toward Peter, who shrugged helplessly. In the shadows, Jason had intercepted the tech booth moments before the cue, his stern words enough to stop the sabotage. Maria took a deep breath, steadying herself. She gripped the edges of the podium, her voice growing stronger. "I'm here tonight to talk about perseverance," she said, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "About what it means to face challenges and refuse to let them define you." Her words hung in the air, resonating with an authenticity that silenced even the quiet murmurs. Maria continued, sharing pieces of her story, her struggles, her fears, and the resilience that had brought her to this moment. Her voice was steady now, filled with conviction. She didn't look at Grace, but the weight of her presence was palpable. From the audience, Anna and Luke watched with pride, their smiles wide. Jason, standing near the side of the stage, felt an unfamiliar sense of admiration for Maria's courage. When Maria finished, the room erupted into applause. She stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding, her cheeks flushed. The ovation was deafening, and for the first time, Maria allowed herself to feel it, triumph. Backstage, Grace was fuming. She turned on Jason the moment he reappeared. "What did you do?" she hissed, her voice sharp. Jason crossed his arms, meeting her glare without flinching. "I stopped you from making a fool of yourself, and everyone else." Grace's face twisted with rage. "You had no right." "I had every right," Jason shot back, his voice rising. "You think you can just tear people down because it makes you feel better? Not tonight, Grace." Emily and Peter exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly unsure of their loyalty. Maria, stepping off the stage, caught a glimpse of the confrontation but chose to keep walking. Tonight wasn't about Grace. It was about her victory. As Maria walked toward her family, a small smile tugged at her lips. For the first time, she felt something shift, not just within herself, but in the dynamics around her. The night wasn't over, and Maria knew challenges still lay ahead. But for now, she let herself savor the moment. Grace Donovan sat at her usual table in the cafeteria, surrounded by Emily, Peter, and the rest of her crew. The noise around them was as loud as ever, but Grace barely noticed. Her mind kept drifting back to the night of the graduation event, replaying Maria Turner's speech. There was something about Maria's words that had unsettled her, a vulnerability, a strength that Grace hadn't expected. For the first time, Grace felt a flicker of doubt about her actions. It wasn't just Jason's interference that had derailed her plan, it was Maria herself. "Grace," Emily's voice cut through her thoughts. "Are you even listening?" Grace blinked, focusing back on the table. Emily was mid-rant about something inconsequential, her tone tinged with its usual self-importance. "Yeah," Grace lied, though her mind was elsewhere. Peter smirked. "You've been weird since last night. What's up?" "Not used to losing." Grace shot him a glare but didn't reply. She couldn't bring herself to admit that, for the first time, she was questioning whether she had been in the wrong. The next day, Grace found herself lingering in the hallway near Maria's locker. She had rehearsed the words 100 times in her head, but now, as Maria approached, they felt like stones lodged in her throat. Maria noticed her immediately, her expression guarded. "Grace," Maria said, her voice flat. "What do you want?" Grace hesitated, her usual confidence evaporating under Maria's steady gaze. I need to talk to you." Maria raised an eyebrow. About what? Another one of your brilliant plans. No, Grace said quickly, her tone softer than Maria had ever heard. Not that. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Maria blinked, momentarily caught off guard. You're sorry? Grace nodded, her eyes darting away. I know that probably doesn't mean much after everything I've done, but I mean it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try to change. Maria crossed her arms, studying Grace intently. Words are easy, Grace. Actions are harder. If you really want to make things right, prove it. The challenge in Maria's voice struck a chord in Grace. She nodded, her resolve firming. I will, she said, her voice quiet but determined. For the rest of the day, Grace's conversation with Maria stayed with her. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced before. But beneath the discomfort was a strange sense of relief, as though admitting her faults had loosened a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. That afternoon, as she sat in the nearly empty cafeteria, Jason approached her. Well, that's a first, Jason said, sliding into the seat across from her. Grace Donovan admitting she was wrong. Never thought I'd see the day. Grace glared at him, but there was no real malice in her eyes. Don't start, Jason. I'm serious, he said, leaning back in his chair. What made you do it? Grace shrugged, staring down at the table. I don't know. Maybe I just got tired of being this person. The person everyone expects me to be. Jason nodded thoughtfully. It's a start. But you know Maria's not going to trust you right away. I know, Grace said quietly. She shouldn't. But I'm going to show her I mean it. Jason's expression softened. Good. Because if you're serious about this, Grace, you might actually surprise people, including yourself. The next morning, Grace made her first attempt at proving her sincerity. She approached the principal's office, where she knew the anti-bullying committee held its meetings. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door and stepped inside. Maria was there, along with the principal, Mrs. Bates, and a few other students. They all turned to look at Grace, their expressions a mix of surprise and skepticism. Grace, Maria said, her voice cautious. What are you doing here? Grace took a step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I want to help, she said, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. Mrs. Bates raised an eyebrow. Help with what, exactly? With this, Grace said, gesturing toward the table where they were reviewing anti-bullying initiatives. I know I'm probably the last person you'd expect to say this, but I want to make up for the damage I've done. I want to do something good. Maria exchanged a glance with Mrs. Bates, who studied Grace carefully. This isn't something you can just waltz into, Maria said, her tone firm. If you're serious, you're going to have to prove it. Grace nodded. I will. Whatever it takes. As Grace left the meeting, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. Maria, watching Grace leave, couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. But trust wouldn't come easily. Grace would have to earn it. In the days ahead, Grace's resolve would be tested, and Maria's caution would remain. But for now, both girls had taken a step forward, however tentative. The last few weeks of the school year were transformative. Maria Turner, once the quiet girl who sat at the edge of the room, now walked through the hallways with a sense of purpose. Her collaboration with Grace Donovan, a partnership no one could have predicted, had set the entire school abuzz. Maria and Grace had thrown themselves into creating the anti-bullying program, working under the watchful eyes of Principal Bates and Mr. Winston. The program wasn't just about rules or punishments, it was about fostering understanding, accountability, and empathy among the students. Let's focus on peer mentorship, Maria suggested during one of their meetings. She sat across from Grace at the large conference table in Principal Bates's office. If students feel like they have someone to talk to, it could prevent a lot of the problems before they escalate. Grace nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes in a notebook. And workshops, she added. Something interactive. People need to actually experience what it feels like to be on the receiving end of bullying. Principal Bates looked up from her own notes, her expression one of approval. Those are excellent ideas. Let's draft a proposal and bring it to the student body. One afternoon, Jason Myers joined the group. He had been lingering on the sidelines for weeks, quietly supporting Maria and Grace's efforts but unsure of how to fully contribute. "Hey," Jason said, sliding into an empty chair next to Maria. "I was thinking, maybe we could include something about online behavior? You know, social media can be a war zone." Maria raised an eyebrow, surprised but impressed. "That's actually a great point. Cyberbullying is just as damaging as what happens in person." Grace smirked. "Look at you, Jason, being all insightful." Jason rolled his eyes but smiled. "Don't get used to it." Emily and Peter eventually joined as well, their initial reluctance giving way to genuine interest. Emily, in particular, seemed determined to prove she wasn't just a follower. "I can handle the graphic design for the posters," Emily said one day, spreading her sketches across the table. "We want the messaging to be bold but approachable." Peter, ever the skeptic, leaned back in his chair. "And what's my job? Be the charming face of this whole thing." "You can start by handing out flyers," Grace quipped, earning a round of laughter. By the time graduation day arrived, the anti-bullying program was ready to launch. It had a name, Voices United, and a mission, to create a culture of kindness and accountability within the school. At the ceremony, Maria sat with her classmates, the weight of the past year finally giving way to a sense of accomplishment. When her name was called, she walked across the stage with her head high, her family cheering from the audience. Later, during the reception, Grace approached Maria. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" Grace said, holding a cup of punch. "All of this, ending." Maria smiled faintly. "It's not the end." "Not really. What we started here, it's going to keep going." Grace nodded, her expression unusually soft. "I'm glad we did this. And I'm glad you didn't give up on me." Maria looked at her, the weight of Grace's words settling over her. "You didn't make it easy," she said, her tone light but honest. Grace laughed. "I never do." In the weeks that followed, Maria packed her bags for college. She had been accepted to a prestigious university on a full scholarship, her dreams finally within reach. As she stood in her room, folding clothes into a suitcase, Luke popped his head in. "You're gonna change the world, you know," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Maria chuckled. "One step at a time." Back at the school, Voices United became a cornerstone of student life. Grace, now a senior, continued to lead the initiative with the same drive she had once used to dominate social hierarchies. Jason, Emily, and Peter all found their own ways to contribute, each of them growing in ways they hadn't expected. Principal Bates and Mr. Winston often reflected on the change they had witnessed. "Maria Turner left more than a mark," Mr. Winston said one day as they watched a group of students participate in a Voices United workshop. "She changed the entire culture of this school. And she did it by showing us all what resilience and compassion look like," Principal Bates added. Years later, Maria would return to visit the school, now a thriving community where kindness was the norm rather than the exception. She would see the program she helped build still going strong, and she would know that her fight had been worth it. But for now, as she stood at the edge of her future, Maria allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had not only risen above the challenges, but had turned them into something beautiful, something lasting. Maria Turner had triumphed, and her light had illuminated the path for others to follow.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.